Hey, welcome back to the channel and welcome back to the Writer's Bookshop. So today we're going to cover another book by Donald Maass. This one's called The Fire in Fiction. And this one is a follow-up to the breakout novel, which we did last week. And we're writing the breakout novel is what it's actually called. This one came out in 2009, so it was a pretty good jump between the two. But just to kind of remind you of who Donald Maass is, he is a literary agent in New York, and part of his approach in writing is to speak to you as an agent who's looking for representation. So if you're not sure what an agent does, an agent is the one who actually allows writers to go to the publishing agencies, because a lot of the big five and even some smaller publishers, they do not take authors without an agent. So if you try to submit your manuscript to, let's say, Simon & Schuster without an agent, you will immediately go into the slush pile, which will later be burned for firewood. And you don't want your hard work to do that, so you have to go through an agent first. And the agent, of course, they have their own slush pile, but the agent, they want to champion your work because they get 15% of your earnings. And so last week when we talked about writing the breakout novel, of course he's coming from the perspective of make me money. But this book today, Fire in Fiction, it's from the perspective of make me more money. So the what we're looking at here is we're looking at some ways in which you can take your mediocre manuscript and elevate it to something that readers truly want. So it kind of goes back to the premise of imagine you're on a plane and you're sitting there just wanting to enjoy your flight, and you have the guy next to you trying to tell him about the dog you just bought and how the dog is his name is Wolfie and he barks a lot, and you don't want to hear this story. You want to be in your own world. You're not you did not invite this guy to speak to you or to tell you a story. And so the same premise comes with your novels. If I pick up a book, I have to want to hear the story for me to keep wanting to read it. Now, obviously, if you've no one's going to throw a book in your hand and point a gun in your head and say you must read this, and then you're going to okay, whatever. Oh, you're not going to have that happen. Hopefully, I mean, if that did happen to you, make sure you contact your local news because they'll want to hear that story. But the thing is, when you have your when you put a book in hand, you are voluntarily decide, look, I'm going to give you a chance. You don't have a lot of time to get me, but I'll give you a chance to hook me up. So part of this book is about trying to make sure that your book is the story that your reader wants, and to make sure that your reader will continue. So even in the beginning sections, he talks about like the dark protagonist and how you have the protagonist that no one wants to read. How do you make that guy or girl somebody that they want to read? And so he uses an example from Chuck Palahniuk's book called Choke, where he has his protagonist is detestable, but he still has this angle of sympathy that he attaches like right at the gate, so that you still have to continue to read and see like what this dude's about. And so that's what this book does kind of in the beginning, and it covers all these different sections of how to approach certain elements of your book so that your reader wants to keep reading. So it is one of Writer's Digest older books, so it's a little taller than what we're used to today. And the other thing too I want to make note of is that it's the way it's designed is it does cover a lot of the same stuff that we're used to by now, but I think Writer's Digest books in particular has taken a bit of a trend in a different direction in the last decade, because it seems like they are focusing more on the basics nowadays, and certainly more divested topics of interest like characters and like there just seems to be a stronger focus on particular sections. Not that they didn't do it in the decade before. But when it comes to like the all-encompassing books like this one, where it covers like the entire book and not just pieces of it, there does seem to be a trend more toward like the basics of structure and what each section should have. It doesn't really go into like what makes each book unique, and this is where I think this one allows you to kind of go a little more into the reality of what makes your book stand out, or what can make your book stand out. So here's an example of their chapter list, just so you're aware of what we're doing here. You have protagonists versus heroes, you have characters who matter, scenes that can't be cut, the world of the novel, a singular voice, making the impossible real, hyper-reality, tension all the time, and the Fire in Fictions, chapter 9. And of course there's an introduction too. And so you notice that from that list, you do have a few of your basics that you want to always go back and reiterate. But then you have a few sections in there that a lot of books never tackle, like how to make the impossible real. And that what that does in particular is it references things like monsters and situations that are impossible. And one example would be like with Terminator. Terminator is a story about a cyborg that comes back in time to kill the mother of the future resistance leader. Now, on the surface, you might be thinking, oh, well, I mean, I guess if I have time, I might watch that, but I think I'd rather watch the dog, because it's like, you can't believe that. Like, that's a dumb story. But if they can set it up so that you not only believe it, but you empathize with the characters and the story, and you can't wait for them to stop the cyborg from killing, it's like, it's like a ridiculous premise, but if you can set it up so that it works and sits in your reader's mind, or in this case, your viewer, if you're a movie, if you're a screenwriter, these are the things that you have to take into consideration when developing your story, because your reader does come with a default switch set to off when it comes to believing this. Sorry, got traffic. When it comes to believing this story, and if your story cannot get your reader to agree with it, and agree with the premise of the setting you're creating, then you've already lost the battle of getting them to read the rest of the book. So that's part of it, is getting them not only interested in the premise, which that's always step one, but getting them to believe in the world. And the best fiction is going to do that, and the fiction that can't do that won't make it to print. Again, this is going into the traditional pile. Don't forget too, this is written in the days before self-publishing blew up. So again, he's coming from the perspective of, do you want to be represented? But it's still important to listen to his notes, because this is also in 2021 days. This is also asking, can you make your book the kind of book that readers won't want to return if they buy it, or if they can you get them past the Amazon preview? So these are the things to consider. So let me just kind of, again, just show you some of the formatting they do. So every chapter ends with what he calls the practical tools. It looks like this. So, over here. So this is kind of like a summary of the section, but it's also a way to help you kind of think in terms of developing your scenes and chapters. In the introduction, he talks about how whenever he gets a new manuscript in, he immediately gets to his notepad and starts writing reasons why he should reject the book. And it's important to think about what makes that essential, because if you consider this, like if you were writing a novel and you do send it off for representation, you do have to question, like, is there a reason why your agent won't want this? Well, your agent will be looking for reasons why they shouldn't take the book. So you don't want to give them that ammo. So basically, Donald Maass is kind of giving you the checklist of things that you should do if you want to avoid, having that notepad of his fill up too much. So, that's just some of the things to consider. So just quickly, I want to just go over some of the sections in here, just so you kind of know what's in the book. And I read this book years ago, so I'm going off of memory and quick skim. Obviously, if you read the book, you're going to get a much better picture of what's truly in here. But I want to make sure you have an understanding of what you're buying should you get this. And I do want to emphasize, too, that even if you're a veteran author, of course you're going to get the overlap. You're going to get that with most books anymore. But there's still a few sections that just aren't talked about much anymore. And I know in me in particular, I write with exaggeration in my stories. I have a tendency to want to put characters, like the fish out of water story, where the character is like the only normal person in an insane world, or vice versa. And of course, to make that believable, you have to make sure that the world fits the storyline and just a lot of little components to go in place. And it's something that a lot of writers don't tackle. A lot of writers, they just try to tell the straight story, which is fine. That's what readers often want. But I know for me in particular, I get bored with writing just normal characters all the way through. I do like my exaggerated heroes or characters, and I like I do like to occasionally have that moment where it's just kind of eye popping, like I can't believe that happened sort of moment. And so a lot of what I want to approach, I want to make sure is working. So that's something that this chapter does cover, is how to make something like that work. So anyway, let me go through the list here. So in chapter 1, the protagonist versus heroes, you have average Joes, Jane Does, and dark protagonists. You have cutting heroes down to size, greatness, and then protagonist versus heroes. So you might be thinking like, well, what does that mean, a protagonist versus hero? So that's sort of the point he's making, in that, a protagonist is like an ordinary guy that you happen to follow. Can you make that person interesting? Typically, we want heroes. Typically, we want these people who have missions and goals that we want to follow. If your protagonist is a plumber who the whole story is about him trying to fix a leaky pipe, I mean, in and of itself, that's dumb. Like, that's not even worth reading as an essay. The only way that would work ever is if you give him a world or a situation where that becomes like, it's like the pipe that saves the world, or something of like that nature. Something where he becomes more of a hero. But even then, if he's still just an average Joe, how do you make him into a hero? So these are the differences between who's a protagonist and who's a hero. Then you have the characters who matter. So those are the differences between special, the ordinary, and then the antagonist. I have one of my characters, actually, he's an ordinary guy, sort of. I mean, he's a sports star, so if that's not ordinary, but he becomes more special as the story goes on. Scenes that can't be cut. So these are the things where if you're editing your book, you need to make sure that these scenes are present, otherwise they have to go. And so basically it's a way of tightening your story down to the essentials, but these are the scenes that include outer and inner turning points, dialogue. The section called starting forward and falling back is about the scenes that have momentum. In other words, this scene has to happen in order for this next scene to happen, and that scene has to happen because the next one has to happen, and so on. So it's about making sure that your scenes naturally fit each other and are all important to the story. First lines and last lines, and then the tornado effect. So the tornado effect is about the big events that shape your protagonist's world. This is, I think, especially true like in literary fiction when nothing happens. So you have something happen, like in Grapes of Wrath, you have the Dust Bowl. That's a pretty big event, and how the entire story is about them. If I recall, it's about them going from one place to another trying to make $1, and the event itself is what makes their story interesting. Or even something like The Road, apocalyptic story. There are ways to make this, the big event shake your characters up. That's what that's about. The world of a novel. So this is where you link details and emotions. You measure change over time. So measuring change over time, this is a good one, because when you're writing a story, you have to remember that time is still going forward. And if you get time wrong, you're going to get your book wrong. So I want to give the illustration of, again, going back to Terminator. I never thought Terminator 3 was a bad movie. I know a lot of people wanted it to escape the canon, because it's like following Terminator 2. First of all, you should never follow Terminator 2. Terminator 2 is a perfect movie. Any movie that follows it is not going to be as good. It's just inevitable. The only reason why you would even bother doing that is if you intend for it to have an ongoing franchise where you eventually get to the end of the war, and which is what I always thought they would do, especially when they started on that trajectory. But with Terminator 3, the big flaw with Terminator 3 was not the movie itself. The big flaw, in my opinion, with Terminator 3 was the fact that they got time wrong. If you go back to Terminator 2, John Connor is 10 years old. James Cameron made it very clear in interviews that he was 10. The movie takes place when he is 10. And if you do math, that puts it about 1995, when the story takes place. Even though they got a 13-year-old actor to play the character was 10. So you fast forward to Terminator 3 when you get a completely different director. And don't forget, too, they also mentioned a particular date in Terminator 2 that would have happened when the character was 12. Okay? And you get this math when you go back to like the first movie, when you see that John Connor was born in February of 1985. And so mathematically, if he's 10, that puts the current movie in sometime in 1995. And then they say the Judgment Day happens in August 29th, 1997. Okay, so when the character is about 12. Terminator 3 comes out, and of course, it's in the future, and it's about an adult John Connor running from his destiny. So I thought thematically the movie was great. I thought the movie, it's one of the movies I go to when I talk about themes. I thought they got the theme perfect. You know, the theme of you can't outrun your destiny, and you know, if you're destined for a greatness, it's going to find you no matter how far you try to run from it. It's going to get you. But because they got time wrong, they rewrote the story so that he's 13 when Judgment, or when the events of Terminator 2 happen. And it's like, well, if he's 13 when that happened, well then wouldn't that be 1998 after Judgment Day happened? And this is where you begin to have this mental stew of like, you just lost me. Yeah, you just made the unbelievable actually unbelievable. And so this is where, like, when they get the math wrong, when they get time wrong, it really screws up the story for me. You know, and Spider-Man: Homecoming did a similar error. It wasn't nearly as egregious because the error was primarily in a title card, where it said 8 years later. I mean, they could have, even in just going to Blu-ray, they could have just post-processed that to say 4 years later and then just fix it. It would have been easy. And even with a dialogue piece, you know, like if they screwed up the dialogue, I could just, you know what, maybe the character is bad at math. You know, he said 8 years, maybe he meant 4 years. I'm willing to, you know, eat that up for that to work. With Terminator 3, they actually made the entire story hinge on the fact that he was 13. When he wasn't 13, he was 10. Get your math right, get your time right. And that's why I think Terminator 3 ultimately was a bad movie. You know, if you watch it independently of the other two, it was a fine movie. It was okay. It was actually worked pretty well. But in comparison to the ones that it followed, it ruined it. And this is why I think Terminator as a series is just blown up, because they are not consistent with their own rules and their own. Even I didn't watch the new one, Dark Fate. I just skipped it because I like, you know what, I know what happens. I'm like, you just ruined the whole point of the story. Like it's like there's nothing to follow now. Like, you know, so I don't know if they're going to even do anymore, and that might be a good thing, which is a shame because they had such a good idea. If you just followed the path that you started, take us to the end of the war. That's the story we want to follow. That's readers get involved in, or movie watchers, they get involved in this storyline because they care about these characters and their situation, the fire that you put in that fiction. Take us to the end point, you know, where actually everything you establish matters. And if you ruin that by changing up the formula, or changing up the idea, or changing up the philosophy, or doing something in a way that doesn't necessarily ring true with the original storyline anymore, even if you're trying a new philosophy, I mean, characters change, sure, but the whole thing that makes the stories worth following, if you change that, forget it, you're done, and the franchise is done. In effect, you ruin 1 and 2. You know, just by knowing that the others exist, you ruin 1 and 2. And I know that's a bit of a rant, but that's something I think is really important. Like, if you're a reader or movie watcher can end up with a rant like that, you've done something wrong. So time matters. Get it right. And this is, you know, there's ways you can do that. You can do a timeline, but I think it's important that it's not just about the timelines that we keep, you know, in our series Bibles, but we also we factor in how long things happen. So, like, even in a scene of dialogue, if your characters are talking to each other and there's a moment where you have a long exposition of thought, that thought takes time. That, you know, however much time it takes the reader to get through the bottom is probably how much time that protagonist is thinking about that thing. So the natural progression of dialogue would seem odd if suddenly the conversation never broke off. Now, there's ways you can still make that work, but I know I play with that rule. I have in I think it's in the second modern day fantasy story, which, again, those of you watching this, it's going to be broken in pieces. So I think I don't even know if it's going to be book 4 or 5 when I finally end up doing all that. But there's an actual scene where the guy's love interest, she's not actually, they're not together. It's like it's the one he pines for, is basically yelling at him for something he did, and like this is a long passage of inner monologue happening while she's talking. And there's a moment where it's like you get to the end of it and she's like, hello, you listening to me? So, you know, you can still do that. You can still play with that format, but time matters. Okay, I got way off track, but I just think that's an important thing to cover. You got to make sure your time works. Make sure your math works. Where did I leave off? Where am I? Am I even on the same page here? Hold on. I'm sorry. I got so heated on that. Okay, so history's personal. So this is like, you know, I guess for historical fiction, but even like if you're referencing old events that happen, do that. Seeing through the character's eyes. So that's your point of view. Conjuring a Maloo. So this is I struggled with this for a long time, trying to figure out what that word even meant. But what that essentially means is you're establishing your world building. So if you imagine Lord of the Rings, and you have a world full of humans, orcs, dwarfs, and elves, like that's your Maloo. You have the fantasy kind of setting, and and how they all work together or don't work together, as the case may be. So it's allowing the pieces to fall together in order to create a world that's believable to your reader. Then of course you're setting his character, and we did talk a little bit about that in active setting. But yeah, when your setting itself becomes part of the character, like New York stories often have that. Like anything Woody Allen is going to have New York as a character. Singular voice, giving characters voice, details and delivery, the different ways of relating a story. And now, if you've read the book we did a couple weeks ago on the Writer's Guide to Voice, I think it was called. It was one from Writer's Digest, their compilation. So I couldn't remember if Donald Maass's chapter in that book came from the writing the breakout novel or Fire and Fiction. It was the Fire and Fiction. I just went back and affirmed that, like, the passage in this book is in that story, so, or in that other book. So if you do have both books, you're going to have a little bit of overlap in that section. It doesn't mean you shouldn't reread it again. Everything is worth reading twice if you're learning. But this is the one that has that passage, just so you know. Excuse me. Then chapter 6, this is where I think it starts to go into the realm of important to any writer, no matter how big your library gets. The next two chapters, I believe, is what makes this book worthy of the shelf, because not very many books cover these sections. Now, maybe one day we might get something dedicated to this, but for the most part, right now, you can't even get this stuff in like the regular crafting books. So this is where I think it's important. The first chapter, or chapter 6, is called Making the Impossible Real. You have the skeptical reader, making characters afraid, focus on villains, verisimilitude, pseudoscience and genuine facts, and the scary monsters. And this is also where they talk about like the conspiracy theories and things like that. What this is doing is giving you a position to make a storyline like the Terminator storyline of a cyborg coming back to kill the future leader's mother. Like, these are things that we don't naturally gravitate toward believing. So this is about making that unbelievable story believable. And same thing with like monster stories, the vampire stories. How do you make a vampire story believable? So that's what this whole chapter is about, is setting up a storyline where your reader will immediately buy into the premise, in spite of the fact that it would never happen in real life. And so I think it's a really powerful chapter to go through. And if you can adapt its principles, I think you too can make your Mermaid Avenger story actually work. Excuse me. Chapter 7, Hyperreality. So this is again in my wheelhouse. I like to exaggerate my characters a little bit, and so for me this is a section I think is worth going through. It's not very long, it's 20 pages, but it's nevertheless covers interesting elements that every writer might be tempted to go into. So this is the Secrets of Satire, so how to make an exaggeration actually work for your story. Funny people, funny places, good for comedies. Sending up society, that's when you, again, satire plays into that a lot, where you're, I guess you're trying to show your point of view in the context of an alternate point of view, I believe. I actually have to go back and refresh my memory of what that one's about. But anyway, it's still in that realm of making sure your reader understands the point of view you're talking about. Just a quick passage from Sending Up Society. It's hard to compete with the great social art satirists of our day, such as Tom Wolfe, but it can be done. What does it take? Again, I believe it begins not with choice of subject, but with a will to point out what is puerile, peculiar, and pernicious in our world, and then to do so with gleeful malice and at great length. Satire is not a simple tone to adopt. It's a mission to embrace. Satiric novelists are, to me, less like occasional wits and more like Marines. So, oh yeah, and this is where he references Jennifer Government, which, if you're familiar with me or my channel, you know I'm a big fan of Max Berry. Max Berry is the author of Jennifer Government, and even though Jennifer Government's not my favorite of his novels, I do think it's one of my favorite of his premises, where the story is about, it's another one of his marketing satires, and it takes place in the future, and in that story world, people are no longer known by their surnames. Like, I'm not Bercy anymore. Now I am College. Or I'm not gonna name my college, but it's your surname becomes your employer, like your corporate employer. So it'd be like, Bob Walmart or Fred Amazon, something like that. Or Jeff Amazon. Maybe still just Jeff Bezos, but still, you have the idea of Jennifer Government is that whatever your last name is, that's who you work for. So Jennifer works for the government, and the story goes that a guy named I forget his first name, it's something Nike. I think it's like Bob Nike or Bill Nike or whatever. He decides he wants to do a corporate campaign to attract people to his new shoe. By murdering them. And it's like basically the premise is there are 10 assassinations of people who buy these shoes, and it's the satire of marketing and how marketing works and how people are attracted to a product that's, whether you like it or not, you have to have it because, and it's like it's taking the extreme idea of, it still ends up becoming a cop story. I mean, it's still ultimately about trying to nab the people who orchestrated this campaign, because it's still ultimately a crime. But so there's still an element of, it's not so hyper real that it's ridiculous. It still grounds the premise into a world that still fits our systems of laws, which I think is what makes it genius. But it's still taking that next level of how far marketing might go to get people to buy a product is absolutely insane. But it works really well. And the only reason why it's not one of my favorites is because I thought it was a little too sharply edited. Like, I like transitions, and I felt like it was kind of choppy in places. But then again, I read a lot of it at a coffee shop, so maybe I just needed to get away from people to read it. But anyway, great book. Anything by Max Berry. Eventually, one of these days, if I haven't started it already, I think I'm going to do a side series about the Reader's Bookshelf, and that'll certainly be on there. I'll talk more about it then. But that's where you're setting up society. So I think good books will do that. I think really books that say something will do that in some form, even if it's subtle. I think you always got to do a little bit of a critique of what is happening in real life, because if real life is stupid, then you need to call it. And I think we're in a time right now where real life has gotten stupid. So I wouldn't be surprised if you start seeing more voices speaking up and saying, "Look, come on, let's take a step back and." Let's just let's see how far this goes, and in fiction. And I feel like we've already had that story, but anyway, whatever. Let's move on. Funny voices, and then of course that's where you have like your Holden Caulfields and your people who their perspective is hyper real. Actually, I'm not sure Holden Caulfield's got a hyper real perspective, but he still delivers in a voice that you want to follow along because it's funny. So then you have tension all the time. So this is where you have tension in dialogue, tension in action, tension in exposition, and which is interesting. And then you have transforming low tension traps, and then tension where there is none. So this is where you establish, even in your setting details, the conflict within the situation, or the conflict within the place. For example, if you have, let's say, there was this news story on I just saw before I went to bed about there was a school bus that was temporarily hijacked by an army, somebody training for the army. I guess I don't know what happened. I don't know the whole story, but basically the bus had school children on there. Now normally, a bus driver taking school children to school would not be an event worth following. It happens all the time. But as soon as you have a a guy with a rifle coming onto a school bus, not knowing what his intentions are. Like, just the fact that he gets on the bus, suddenly everything escalates because you don't know what he's going to do. You don't know what his plan is. So obviously, it turns into a story follows. Now, the good news is, I think, by the way, if this is like this video will air much later than when this happened. I'm recording this in early May right now. It had I wouldn't call it a happy ending. I mean, it's never a happy ending when you have something like that doing that kind of thing. But the guy basically just, he forced the bus driver to drive him a mile, and then he got off. Not a cool thing. The dude really needs to be confronted and arrested and all that, because you just put these kids through trauma. So it's not a happy ending. But the point is like it could have been worse. So it still fits in the realm of tension, where we don't know what's going to happen, and we're grateful that it didn't become worse. But it still was not. Just by nature of the event, it was not something that's settling, right? So these are the kinds of things where, like, even in your kind of generic descriptions, you might pepper it with really kind of questionable things. And so here's an example just from something I'm writing now. I'm writing this for Kindle Vella, but again, I don't know if Kindle Vella is officially open as of this release, but as of this recording, it's still several months off, or it's still months off. I don't know what that even means, but it could be in a few weeks, could be fall, who knows. They say summer, so I imagine it'll be sometime soon. But anyway, in the episode I'm writing now, or no, it's one I already I think it's episode 3. The main character goes to talking to this potential trainer he wants to learn martial arts to fight off his bully, but the trainer won't teach him martial arts. He thinks now that it's 1985, everything's more capitalistic. Therefore, he wants to teach him business, and that's where the story kind of goes. But he comes out walking out with a plunger, and his hand's bleeding. And that's all I ever say about it is his hand's bleeding. I never say why, and the character never asks about it. It's just there. Now, it's such a kind of flash in the pan description that you might not even have the tension in there. But as the story progresses, my goal. And again, I'm still writing it, so I haven't fully done this yet. But my goal is to escalate the tension a little bit about, like, is this guy all there? Because even later on, we go into his dojo, and it's a karate dojo, but he's got these swords on his wall. Like, why does he have swords on his wall if it's karate? And they're real swords. And so these are the things that we kind of like, just in the setting, I'm gradually building up the question: is how safe is this guy? And I'm not going to spoil the ending, but the point is like I purposely put these little moments in there to kind of raise the question, what's the truth behind this trainer? Because his style never really gets into the place of nefariousness, but you're always wondering, is there something I should be scared of? And then of course by the ending we find out maybe. Again, I'm not going to spoil it, but there's a reason why these things show up. And so just kind of seeding the tension a little bit here and there, you want to make sure that the way you describe things adds to that tension. So the whole chapter kind of gives you that practical way of escalating that. So, and then lastly, there's the fire and fiction. So this is where it all kind of comes back together. And again, this is something I like this book a lot for this reason. It ties it all together and makes it all important. So the fire and fiction, that's our common experience, our uncommon experience. So this is the difference between what we share and what we don't. I think he references 9/11 in this chapter, I believe. And then of course, the common experience with 9/11 is that we were all horrified by what happened. But the uncommon experience might be the people actually involved in 9/11, those who were in the building, were in the planes, were at the Pentagon, things like that. And of course, the things that follow. Then the moral of the story, what's it all about? And then the fire and fiction, it's kind of his last kind of point of view, reference to just putting it all together. And I think overall it's a book worth reading. And once again, if I didn't mention already, it does have these little section notes at the end. A lot of books in the later decade didn't do this, but it is something that I think books nowadays are starting to do again. But it's where, it's called the Practical Tools. But essentially it's a summary on how to accomplish these goals. Obviously you should read the chapters before you read the notes, but Certainly have the notes handy for you when you go through and write your book and you go through and make sure everything works. I do think this is a good book to read before you start writing. It's not really the best of revision books, but you can still look through your in-text to find out, if whether or not you're willing to take the components you've read about and place them onto the story you've written, to make sure everything fits. And again, if you know this stuff going into it, it's going to make it a lot easier to plan for it and factor it in as you write. But even if you messed up, there's still ways you can fix it if you just employ these strategies. And it may take more work, but it's worth taking. Because ultimately, if your goal is to get traditionally published, you do want to stay off the slush pile. And if your goal is to self-publish, your goal is to make sure your reader gets past the look inside on Amazon. So it's just make it matter. And then if you want that 5-star review, make sure it matters all the way through. It's really that simple. So anyway, that's The Fire and Fiction by Donald Maass. I think it's probably, you definitely want to get that with the other book we covered if you're going to get either. I think he's, because he's a literary agent who has to represent authors, I do think that he's worth listening to. This is an important voice, and I definitely think that you need to give him consideration when you read his books. But anyhow, that's Fire and Fiction. I do hope that you check it out. Make sure you leave a comment below if you do read it, if you do like it, if you find it something that you can get something out of it. Share your experiences. What happens when you actually read the book, or if you've applied his principles, has that shaped your writing at all? So we like to get the feedback. And once again, thank you for sticking to the end. And if you have anything else you want to recommend to readers, go ahead and lay that out in the comments below too. And one day I may cover it. And by the way, I always say to authors out there, if you want me to represent your book, or I'm not an agent, if you want me to cover your book on this channel, do let me know. You can send me a message. By now, if my website's open, you can just send me a direct contact message, or if that's not available to you, you can always just send me a note below. But it's better if you contact me, and just kind of let me know who you are and all that. I always say make sure that your book has been vetted. It should either be published through a publisher or it should have social proof online if you're self-published. Otherwise, I may wait a while. Doesn't mean I won't ever cover it. Again, I'm going to cover books I think are worth reading. So if I've read it and I believe in it, I'll cover it. But anyway, just for your information, that's a new word I made up. Other than that, thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe and do all the things that YouTubers tell you to do. You can also support me and my channel and my efforts by buying any of my books. I do recommend Computer Nerd and Gutter Child. Those are the as of this recording, those are the two that I think are most readable. The others, I am still rebranding, so there's some things that I'm going to eventually take off the market, or maybe transition into my website only. So I would say if you want to play it safe, although I'm still considering making Gutter Child the subplot of a larger novel, it doesn't matter. It's still worth reading. Those are the ones that I feel like are pretty consistently well reviewed. Computer does have a 1-star, but I still think the reader who read it wasn't. The way their feedback makes me convinced that they didn't really get the book. So I haven't had that response from anyone else. So I don't know. Either way, those are the books I recommend if you do want to support me. You can get them on Amazon. Again, or you can go to my website, jeremyversity.com, and just pick through my catalog, see which ones you like. Again, assuming it's open. But yeah, if you want to support me or my channel, that's the best way to do it. I don't have a Patreon or anything like that. At this point, I don't plan on getting one. I really think it's just, get the books. That's the best way to support me. So anyway, it's up to you. Do what you want. I'm happy to have you around. Happy to have you watch the channel and hope you're learning from it. And by all means, if you are benefiting from this series, please let me know. That's what determines whether or not I do season 3 and beyond. It's just knowing people care about this. So let me know. So anyway, that's it for today, and I hope you come back next week. I do have another Donald Maass book I'm going to cover this season. I think he has 5 total. I'm not doing all 5. I will do one more, and then next season I may do the other 2, depending on how things go. But yeah, come back. I do got one more in the queue, and one I think is definitely worth checking out and visit a topic that's not very many people cover. So I think it's again going to be worth coming back for this one. So stay tuned, and we'll see you next week. Thanks again. Bye.